Anyway, how are you?
Doing all right. How are you?
Good. It's been quite a busy month. Yeah. So, did you get a chance? So first of all, welcome everyone. This is beautiful Becca. Welcome to Becca's Book Talks, where I interview people who are avid readers or who have published who have published wonderful, wonderful reads. And I have with me today a Cambridge professor, if I'm not mistaken, right? This is Dr.
Not anymore. No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No.
Update.
No, I was at MIT most recently. Now I am a freelance editor and indexer.
Nice. So, well, this is Dr. Kavita Finn, and at the time when I was looking, I believe this was actually part of my last book blog. I was looking for something on Lord of the Rings, and when I typed it in, I was looking for a specific quote, and one of them directed me to your WordPress site. I'm like, a medieval scholar, fandom studies. I'm intrigued. So that's why I reached out, and I'm so glad that you responded. So let's get started then. What are the top 10 books that have influenced your life and in your profession, whether it be personal narratives or stories that have left a lasting impression on you, and why?
Okay, so this is a really hard question.
If you can narrow it down to 10.
Well, that's always the trouble, isn't it? So I'm a literature scholar, so every book I read does end up influencing me in one way or another. But I will see if I can narrow it down to 10. So the first one that I could think of is Alexandre Dumas Perles, The Count of Monte Cristo, it is definitely one of my favorite books of all time. I read it, oh goodness, I can't even remember when I read it. I was a kid. But I remember my father used to tell me a version of the story, like an extremely heavily abridged version of the story, as a bedtime story when I was maybe 3 or 4. And then when I want to say 9 or 10, I finally read the actual book and I just completely fell in love with it. So it is an amazing book in absolutely every possible way. Yes, it is 19th century. Yes, there are things that are not great every now and again, but it is so good. And the story is just so compelling. It does not feel like a 1,500-page book, even though it is a 1,500-page book. So the next one on the list is another one that... It is a bit of a cheat. I have put Sir Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is the 15th century kind of compilation of lots and lots of medieval Arthurian stories. Yes. And that's partly because, again, the Arthurian legend is something that grabbed me when I was very young, again, like 5, 6 years old. And Thomas Mallory's version is probably one of my favorites as an adult. Later on this list is my other current favorite Arthurian retelling, but I'll get to that. Okay. So Thomas Mallory's version, I wrote a chapter in my thesis about it. I've written articles about it. For whatever reason, it has just grabbed me. It is so wacky and bizarre and often extremely funny. And I used to joke with my students when I was teaching Arthurian literature that the closest film approximation to Mallory's Morte d'Arthur is, in fact, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It is so pitch perfect in so many ways. Like, Mallory's knights actually behave like that. It's a delight. I love it. I got to teach a semester-long deep dive into it when I was at Georgetown, and it was, to this day, probably my favorite class that I have taught.
So going back to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, they actually acted the way you said. More. Oh yeah, most accurate.
That's my take on it. I'm sure there are people who would disagree, but I think that is correct. Next up, again, another cheat, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. It is an entire not an entire series. It is an unfinished series. In theory, someday he may finish it. We don't know. But that is something that I encountered when I was in college for the first time. And it was introduced to me as, and I quote, "The Wars of the Roses, except with dragons," and I was sold in an instant. So I started reading it. I am still a fan of it to this day. I have written, again, like I've written academic articles about it. I have worked on it in a variety of ways. I have extremely mixed feelings about Game of Thrones, but I absolutely love the new series, House of the Dragon. I think it's fascinating. And so it is a very difficult series to explain in a lot of ways, just because I am one of those readers who fully acknowledges everything that is wrong with it, but still manages to love it anyway. So it's like, if you want to give me the list, if you want to give me the laundry list of everything that's wrong, I will accept it, but I still love it.
And that was one of the most interesting things that I read when I was reading global medievalism, is that I had no idea that he didn't even finish the series.
Oh, he has not.
So he hasn't even written the winter. What was it? The something of, what was that?
The Winds of Winter.
The Winds of Winter. I was very surprised. I'm like, what? Then my question was, well, why would these producers approach Martin to even begin the series when it wasn't even completed? That to me was like,
don't know. Like, I think that maybe they thought he was going to finish it in time. I think he thought he was going to finish it in time, and then he didn't. And I mean, to be fair, I understand writer's block. I know how it goes, and it can be absolutely debilitating sometimes. But I mean, I will be curious to see if it's ever finished. I am looking forward to reading whatever it is that comes out. But we'll just have to kind of wait and see. Cool. Next up is a bit of a deep cut. This one is a novel from 1998. It's called Fandom, and it's by Susan Kay. And the reason why I consider it deeply influential in my life is because it was the first piece of fiction that I read that I would classify as published fan fiction. I don't doubt that there were others. There's plenty of them. They're everywhere. But this was the first one that I encountered. And I found it when I was maybe, again, like 11, 12, 13, like that age. Found it completely by accident at the library one day. And at the time, I was at the height of my obsession with the Phantom of the Opera. So immediately I started reading it. I was hooked from page one. It's another one of those where, as I have grown older, I can see the flaws in it, but still love it. That's
question
wonderful.
Though, which Phantom of the Opera? Are you talking about the book by Gaston Leroux, or are you talking about the musical?
Well, both.
Okay.
It started with the musical. Eventually, it went to the book, and this one actually, as far as I know, it has nothing to do with the musical. Like, I feel like they came out around the same time, just completely coincidentally. But so this one is very much based on the book, but it is so good. And it really fills out so much of the backstory that the book kind of skips over. Because, I mean, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux is a mystery, adventure, horror story. It's not really like a big tragic thing. Whereas Susan Kay's Phantom is deeply tragic and wonderfully written. So
that's the thing that I've been noticing. Like, and I want to say maybe around the time, I'm not sure, because I still haven't read his books yet. But have you read anything by what's his name, Gregory Maguire?
It was a long time ago. I read Wicked, way back when the book first came out, I want to say.
There seems to be, I was just going to say, there seems to be this, what you mentioned in countertelling or counter restoring and then restoring, about taking like the opposite, or looking at the perspective from the one who is either the antagonist or a side character, and making them more what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess pushing them towards the front and seeing it through their lens. It's
Yes.
just an interesting concept. Like we've had Part of Your World, we've had Lost in a Book, all of these different retellings, but it's through the ones that we have been, you could say, brainwashed to hate, which is really unique. That's cool.
No, and the fairy tale retelling genre is one that I've been familiar with it for a long time. I really like it. I've loved it since I was in middle school. It's a great kind of genre. I get it. It is overdone to a point. Like there's so many of them out there, you can't keep track of them all.
Yes.
But when it's done well, it is staggeringly good. And yeah, I've actually read a bunch of those recently, just because they happen to be sort of coming across my attention. But actually, speaking of counter storytelling, one of the other books on my list is actually the book that introduced me to that concept, which is Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's The Dark Fantastic. That is it's an academic book, but the way that she writes is very accessible. And I would really recommend it to, that's my answer to number 2. So I might wait and talk about it more later.
Okay.
But it's wonderful. It's a book that came out, I want to say 2016. It's either 2016 or 2017. I don't remember. Might even have been later than that. I don't recall off the top of my head, but it is a really excellent book. And I will provide a bit more detail about it to the next question.
Okay.
So other things on my list, there's William Shakespeare, complete works. Again, I'm cheating, but there we go. So I discovered Shakespeare at 2 separate times, I think. First, when I was very little, because my parents had a copy of the complete works of Shakespeare that had like the gold tinted pages. And I always enjoyed like playing with it. So I would open it and I would look at all of the titles and I would have no idea what was in any of the plays, but I would want to kind of look at them and look at the cast lists and see kind of who the characters were and then not read the play. Then later on, when I was like 9, 10-ish, I watched the film version of Romeo and Juliet for the first time. And that was what kind of catapulted me into the plays. So I watched it on my own. This was before I had to read it for school or anything. I watched it on my own, and the language just consumed me. It was so good. And so I started off with the tragedies. I did a little bit of the comedies here and there, but mostly like the tragedies and the histories are where I tend to live. And I started off with kind of Romeo and Juliet, then I went on kind of a tangent and got obsessed with Hamlet in high school, as one does. I was probably insufferable. And then about end of high school was when I first read Richard III, which was my first of the history plays, and that's been kind of my thing ever since.
And I remember watching the documentary about the discovery of Richard III's
the King of the Car Park.
Yes, the King of the Car Park. That was because I had the recording of it. I'm like, oh my God, really? What are the odds?
Wild.
What are the odds of that? Jeez.
Ridiculous. No, it was so funny when that happened back in 2012, because it was 2 years after I had finished my doctorate, and my doctorate was on the Wars of the Roses. So suddenly Richard III was in the news, and I had just like members of my family suddenly like texting me or messaging me on social media saying, hey, this is your stuff, isn't it? Like, it's in the news. What's going on? Are you suddenly relevant? I'm like, yeah, actually, apparently I am. Didn't see that one coming. But and speaking of Richard III, another book on this list is The Sunne and Splendour by Sharon K. Penman, which is a historical novel published, I think, again, like 1988, 1989. For whatever reason, like that was a good couple of years. So this one, it's this gigantic novel. It is maybe like 800, 900 pages long or something ridiculous like that. And it is about the life of Richard III, and it is essentially the diametrical opposite of Shakespeare's play. Because in this book, he is the hero. He is, I will be honest, a little too perfect for my reread tastes. But at the time, I was sold. At the time when I first read it as a teenager, I was like, yeah, Richard III was wronged. Everyone was wrong about him. Only Sharon Penman's right about him. And again, insufferable for a while. But eventually, as I got older, I read more about it. I read the primary sources. I am now largely unconvinced by Saint Richard, but that does not make the book any less good.
Right.
It is still like some of the best portrayals of the kind of supporting cast are in there. And it's just phenomenally well researched, even though the author herself acknowledges that like she didn't have access to some of these sources. Some of them have been reinterpreted. Obviously, the finding of Richard's body has made things very, very different.
Yes.
And so she actually did, I think when the book was reissued a couple of years ago, she actually did a brand new introduction for it where she explained like, yep, I admit I was wrong about all of this stuff, but we didn't have this information in 1988 when I was writing this book. So I did the best that I could. And
yeah, absolutely.
The late Sharon Penman, I'm afraid I should say, she died 2 years ago. But one of the things I always respected about her as a historical novelist is that she would write these detailed author's notes and put them at the very end of her book, where she would explain, I made this change on purpose. I put this character here when they were historically there. I did it for this reason. It was the first time I had seen an author do that in a historical novel. And I have taken that away and thought, you know what? If I ever actually finish a historical novel, it will have like a 30-page author's note at the end explaining every single thing that I did.
And I'm sorry, it was called The Sunne and the Splendour, or just The Sunne and Splendour?
The Sunne in Splendour, I-N.
Oh, The Sunne in Splendour, I'm sorry.
And it's spelled S-U-N-N-E, so sort of Middle English-ish.
Oh, for Sunne.
Yeah, S-U-N-N-E.
S-U-N-N-E.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction because there are apparently several books with that same title, and they're all spelled differently. So
got it.
So then again, sort of coming back to kind of academic books, there was a book I read when I had just finished my master's degree, and I was sort of flailing around and trying to figure out what I wanted to do for my PhD. And I came across this book by Michael Dobson and Nicola Watson. It was, again, an academic book called England's Elizabeth: An Afterlife in Fame and Fantasy. And it was essentially fictional portrayals of Queen Elizabeth I from her lifetime to what was then the present day. I think it was published in 2002 or 2003. So it was so fascinating because it starts during Queen Elizabeth I's lifetime, talking about plays that were produced, pamphlets, poems like Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, all of this stuff. And then going through the intervening centuries to the present day, it talked about 19th century, these absolutely wild 18th and 19th century novels that gave Elizabeth secret children, secret twin sisters, secret like cousins who were trying to steal her throne. There are some absolutely wild things in there. Wow. And then through like the 19th century obsession with Mary, Queen of Scots, where Elizabeth became a villain, and then into the 20th century, where people tried to kind of reappropriate her as a feminist icon. And it brought us up through, I think one of the last things that they discussed is the Shekhar Kapur movie from 1998, because the sequel hadn't come out yet, the one with Cate Blanchett.
Elizabeth the Golden Age, if I'm not mistaken.
No, that's the sequel.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Elizabeth the Golden Age is the sequel, which is extremely pretty and extremely dumb in a lot of ways. Okay. The first one is also extremely pretty, and it makes some highly questionable choices from time to time, but it's still a good time. It's fun to watch.
So which one was the first one then?
Just Elizabeth. It's just called Elizabeth.
Okay.
And it came out in 98, the same year as Shakespeare in Love. And so
Mm-hmm.
the two of them were kind of battling it out in the awards circuit that year, I remember. And I think Shakespeare in Love won most of the awards
Yeah,
over Elizabeth.
so did a Dame Judi Dench, who portrayed her
Mm-hmm.
brilliantly. So.
Yes, yes, she did. Yeah, and she and Cate Blanchett were kind of on opposite ends of Elizabeth's lifetime there, because Cate Blanchett was portraying kind of young Elizabeth when she was first getting to the throne,
Yes.
and Judi Dench was portraying her having been on the throne for, I think, 40, 50 years at that point. So it was a good year for Elizabeth that year. So that was one. And then another book that just came out a couple of years ago in 2020 is called Scripts of Blackness. It's by Noémie Ndiaye, Ndiaye. And it is about early modern drama and race. And it is phenomenally good. She looks at drama from England, drama from France, and drama from Spain. And she puts all three of them in conversation with each other. She is ridiculously brilliant. She's a professor at University of Chicago. And she just has this way of explaining things where you finish a chapter and you think, oh yeah, of course, this is absolutely 100% correct. I have no idea why I never saw this before. Mm-hmm. And she has a way of taking plays that I have read many, many times over and forcing me to completely re-examine them. So it's a fabulous book.
That's the word I was looking for. Re-examining. She's what it is.
Yes. It is a fabulous book. It has won so many awards, and they are all very, very well deserved.
It's called Scripts of Blackness. And I'm sorry, what's the author's name again?
Her last name is spelled Ndiaye, Ndiaye. And her first name is Noémie, Noemie. And the first E in it has a little accent.
So it's Ndyaye, Ndiaye?
Ndiaye.
A-Y-E. Got it.
Yes.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
And is that also considered like a type of academic?
Yes, it is definitely an academic book. It is it can be a little hard to read at times, but I found it to be just wonderfully written. And then last but not least is the Arthurian retelling that I mentioned earlier, which I believe to be the best Arthurian retelling that I have ever read, which is, I think, saying something because I have been reading them since age 6. So it is called Legendborn, and it's by Tracy Deonn.
Yeah, that one is listed here in the book, and you have a personal like you rave about it in this yes. particular one.
Yes, Legendborn. And the sequel has come out. It came out last November. It is very good. I did not find it quite as good as the first, but that may change once the third one comes out and we have the full story. But in the meantime, the first one is absolutely phenomenal. The second one is still very, very good. But kind of necessarily because it's the second book in what is at least a trilogy and might be 4 books, depending on.
Is that, I'm sorry, let me just go back. I'm not going into that yet, but Legendborn, is that based on, you mentioned it in here, I'm not sure if it's the same one. Is that please forgive me if I say it right, the Daevabad trilogy? Is that one, or is that completely different?
Completely different.
Maybe I read it wrong.
Yeah, they are. That I discussed both of the books in the chapter. They're both, like, one of them was the first half of the chapter, one of them was the second half of the chapter.
Right.
But the Daevabad trilogy is a completely different thing, and it's also very good. Highly recommend. But it is a sort of second world fantasy that is based on Middle Eastern mythology. And it is, again, just really wonderful, great world building. It's great. The author has a bunch of other books that are kind of orbiting that one. They're not necessarily related, but they can be if you want to.
the Legendborn, is that just called the Legendborn trilogy, or is it just, does it go by another name? Do you know?
I don't know if the actual series has a name. People just refer to it as the Legendborn series. But I do not know if that is the official title or not.
Okay.
And I think that is 10. I'm fairly sure I managed to get 10 in there.
But you were going to go back to what was that one
Yes.
that you wrote that was oh, help me out here. The Dark Fantastic, I think you were going to mention.
Yes.
So that one, so of those 10, that's the one that you would recommend for today's readers?
Yes, that is absolutely. I mean, I opened with like, I recommend every single one of these, but if you are into science fiction and fantasy, even a little bit, or if you're into fandom studies or anything like that, The Dark Fantastic is a amazing book. And again, it's another one that just causes me to completely rethink so many of my assumptions. I first came across it after listening to an interview with the author, where she actually gave a voice to a lot of feelings that I had and I'd experienced, but I'd never been able to articulate, about being a woman of color in fan spaces. I'm not even familiar with all of the different books and shows that she discusses. I'm familiar with some of them. She talks about Harry Potter. She talks about The Hunger Games. She talks about Sleepy Hollow, and she talks about Merlin. And there might be a couple of others in there as well. But she gives such a compelling analysis of how female characters of color are treated in mainstream narratives, and how fans of color then push back against those kind of unsatisfying representations. But one of the things I like to say is, if you want to see what happens when a Black author who has read Ebony Thomas takes on the Arthurian legend, that is where Legendborn comes from. And it's, as I said, it is hands down the best Arthurian retelling I have ever read.
Arthurian, and it's by Ebony Thomas.
Yes, that's The Dark Fantastic, by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. I think she teaches at University of Michigan.
So, based on all of these, but what was the last story that you read, and what were your thoughts and takeaways from that particular read?
The one that I just finished was, I just finished two of them. One of them was Rule of Wolves by Read-Bardugo. It's one of the later books in the Grishaverse series. It's one, I'm very, very late to this party. I only started reading this series because I saw the first season of Shadow and Bone on Netflix and was intrigued by about half of the plot and wanted to know what else was going on. But one thing that I really appreciate about this series is that, at least for me, the later 4 books are much, much stronger than the initial 3. It's one of those where you can actually watch the author improve over the course of the series, and it's really interesting for me to read from kind of a craft perspective. But like the first trilogy, and I've explained this to basically everyone who I recommend this to, is like the first trilogy's okay, read it for the world building, but where she really takes off is there's 2 books called like the Six of Crows books, and then there's 2 books called the King of Scars books, that are much, much stronger. And partly I think it's because she kind of pulls out of that YA first person perspective and has a bunch of different characters doing a bunch of different things. And it feels like after she was successful with the first series, she was able to write what she really wanted to write in that universe. And I think it shows in the kinds of stories that she puts together later on.
The rule, but this goes back to the Rule of Wolves, or is this the Six of Crows you're talking about?
Both, actually, but Rule of Wolves was the last one that I read, and it's the second book in the King of Scars kind of duo.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay.
And it is, again, like, I don't want to talk too much about it because it will be absolutely spoilery if I do, but I will just say the first trilogy's okay. The second set of like 2 duologies are fantastic.
Got it. And Shadow and Bone is based on is based on that. Sorry, is based on the King of Scars one.
No, it's based on the earlier ones. Like, so Shadow and Bone did this, what I thought was a very good narrative choice, where they merged the first trilogy with the 2 Six of Crows stories. and kind of had these two parallel plot lines running that eventually were supposed to converge. I assume they converge in season 2 because I have not actually seen season 2 yet. And so I remember them about to converge at the very end of season 1. So I do not know what happens in the show yet. I do eventually plan to watch it, but in the meantime, it was fun to kind of see how everything was very different in the books, because in the books, these characters never don't encounter each other until much, much, much later. Whereas in the show, they encounter each other much earlier. And I am very curious to see kind of the different direction that the show ends up taking from that point of view.
Okay. A lot of, well, because I'm into, because most of the books that you mentioned earlier about Arthurian retelling and medievalism, I'm working on a big project, working on it since I think 2013, 2012, something like that. It's been, it's just, there's a lot. I think I'm doing more, I think I'm overdoing more research than I am the writing part. That's a challenge for me. But speaking of challenges, so are you taking part in a reading challenge with your local library or another challenge at the present time?
Not presently, no, only with myself these days. I feel like I sometimes should, though, because I've read or reread more than 60 books since the start of August, so maybe I ought to. But wow. No, it's mostly just been reading because it's fun.
That's cool. So speaking of readership, here's the next question. What do you believe is the biggest obstacle that is facing our readers today in the wake of the current banned or challenged books list from last year and from this year alone, considering, the students and the teachers, the libraries, bookstore clientele? What do you think is the biggest obstacle that's facing us right now?
Well, first, that is a big question, and it's a loaded question. So I'm going to start kind of on systemic problems, even though that is probably going to make me seem like a complete pessimist. The fact is that the educational system in the United States is deeply, deeply flawed and in some ways broken. You have teachers and librarians who are chronically under-resourced, underpaid, overworked. And you have parents, often in bad faith, blaming them because it's easier than trying to change anything. And what really needs to happen, at least in the United States, is an enormous influx of money into the educational system that is earmarked to pay their employees. Not shareholders, not administrators, but teachers, librarians, janitors, special ed, like all of those people. I see how much work, I have 2 kids. I see how much work their teachers do. And I see how challenging things are for them, especially now between remote learning and technology and AI and all of that crap. And the thing is, like, they teach in a well-funded school by pretty much any standard. So if they are having problems, it is staggering how other school districts and other teachers and other employees are forced to contend with that. As for book banning, I'll be honest, I don't believe in it. There are terrible books out there that I would never want my children to read, but somebody needs to read them in order to explain why they're awful and why they're wrong. I have participated on kind of book committees for my local school district before. And I have always been the one who's coming in saying, why is everyone complaining about this book? There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. There was one in particular. It was a YA novel that was set in ancient Greece. And it was a really interesting book. I thought, I cannot remember the title of it off the top of my head, but it was a very interesting book. It combined sort of epistolary material, kind of bits of poetry, bits of descriptions of art, descriptions of archaeological finds, and actual narrative. It combined all of these things together. And I remember explaining to this committee, and all of us were kind of in agreement that this was a bit of nonsense, but explaining exactly why this book was valuable, what it was going to teach kids, and why it was important to keep it on the shelves.
So basically, when it comes to book banning, you're saying is that even though you may hate, that you yourself may hate some of the books that are just not good for your children or someone else, and everyone has their own opinions, but each of them has something of value, even those that I would consider I wouldn't even dare touch. That they have something to value. They have something to teach, even if it may be the worst. Maybe like the Aftermath as an example. As an example, I don't want to get too far into this, but in what grade was I in? I didn't really understand at the time when I was being taught. I was learning about ethos, pathos, and logos. So, and later on when I taught my kids, I finally understood what those words meant, and I'm like, oh, that's how they went from persuasion to manipulation. And because of my religion, I will not touch the book. I hope I say it right. Mein Kampf.
Absolutely.
I will not even touch it. But my teacher, when I was in 11th grade, and she was saying, if you read it, you could understand how he was able to use persuasion to then manipulate all the people that were under his rule. So crazy.
Even if it's something that I personally just frankly disagree with, I can't get behind that.
So were there any books on the current ban list that you have already read?
Yes. I have read a lot of the older ones on that list, like Toni Morrison, Margaret Atwood, those kinds of books. I have not read a ton of the newer ones, just because there are so many. There are so many books, and you can't keep track of all of them. Eventually, I expect when my kids are old enough that they may start just kind of getting into those books, I might read them in advance. But for the most part, I read the descriptions of them, and I could not see why they were being banned.
And Toni Morrison,
from petty reasons.
And Toni Morrison's, hers was The Bluest Eye. Is that the one? The
Bluest Eye was on there, and I think Beloved was also on there. There were at least 2 Toni Morrison books on there that I saw. Bluest Eye definitely was, and I'm fairly certain the other one was Beloved.
Okay, and then what about Atwood? Is she the one who wrote The Handmaid's Tale?
Handmaid's Tale, yep. Handmaid's Tale is the one that was on there.
So, and it's interesting because the ones that are banned, well, I mean, I haven't read The Handmaid's Tale. I haven't seen the series, but hey, they took that and they made it into a series. So
the book is very interesting, I would say. I liked the book better than the series, but I mean, the series had a lot of good stuff in it, especially the first season, I thought. But there was something really good about kind of the self-contained nature of the book that I liked. Like, it was a very complete story in and of itself.
So was there ever, speaking of all these books that you read, was there ever a story or narrative that was a challenge for you to complete or read through because of the subject matter of the book?
Oh yeah. There have been plenty of books that I have read that bug me tremendously for the content or the subject matter. We had to read, every time someone tried to make me read Ernest Hemingway, I was deeply unhappy. Just because I found his style to be not the writing style, but it was so kind of navel gazy and very white man centric. And I just could not get into it even a little bit. And I tried several times in good faith to read Hemingway, and I just couldn't. And in terms of obviously there are Shakespeare plays that I don't like. I do not like The Taming of the Shrew.
Thank you.
Do not like it.
Thank you.
I have never taught it, partly because I would have so much trouble teaching it. And so Taming of the Shrew, don't like it, never have, never will. And the first time, although actually, no, I can't say never have, because there was a very brief period in 10th grade where we did a unit on the Taming of the Shrew. And even though I didn't like the play, the assignments that my teacher created around the play were so good that she almost made me like it.
I mean, I do not like the story at all, but I would have to say a retelling of the Taming of the Shrew is Kiss Me Kate. I'm not sure if you ever saw that.
Oh, I have. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think that is, I'm sorry, that there are some subjects, or there are some titles of plays, and the retelling of them is 10 times better. So I gotta say that Kiss Me Kate is my personal favorite. So
oh yeah, it's hard to go wrong with Cole Porter. It really is.
Yes.
Yeah, the songs are great.
Yeah, and I think, and I honestly, I had it not, I mean, I wish that Shakespeare definitely had kind of like Alan Bennett's way to put power back into the feminine, like when he did for Dorothy Linton in the History Boys. But I really think that, I mean, Kate kind of does have her final say, but the way that the story was going towards it, it just sounded, like you said, very man-centric.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, why shouldn't a woman be as powerful as you are? Why can't she still be full of being stubborn and full of pride? What is the matter with that? What is the problem? It's almost as pride and stubbornful as, like what you said here, Daenerys Targaryen and Arya Stark. Why not have that? They've been shaped because of that. So I have to agree with Kate, though.
Yeah, and an interesting thing is, even this wasn't exactly in Shakespeare's lifetime, but it was slightly after Shakespeare's lifetime. Someone wrote a sequel called The Tamer Tamed, which means that at least at that time, even then, audiences were saying, I don't know about this. So it is something that people were pushing back against, at least up to a point, even in the 17th century.
So it's called The Tamer Tamed?
It's called The Tamer Tamed, yep.
Ooh,
and I think it is technically a sequel, but it might just be kind of a reworking.
That'll be interesting to look into.
But in terms of I can give kind of a little bit of a counterexample as well, a story that was a challenge to read for the subject matter, but that I still found tremendously rewarding. So recently, over the summer, I read what I can only call this absolutely incredible retelling of King Lear. It is called We That Are Young, and the author is Preeti Taneja, Taneja. It is set in contemporary India, and it is an absolute masterpiece. It is so, so good, but it hurts to read because there is so much misery and awfulness in it, and she depicts it with absolute clarity, unflinching detail. And if you know King Lear, you know it ends really, really badly for everybody involved. Spoilers for a 400-year-old play. So seeing that play out in a contemporary setting with a number of characters who make terrible choices, but are nonetheless understandable, if not entirely sympathetic, it is a very tough read, but I found it to be well worth the time.
And it's called We That Are Young, or We Who Are Young?
We That Are Young.
We That Are Young. Got it.
Yes.
So so in this case, it's through the lens of the children.
Yes, it is almost, and I think there might be one section that's from kind of the Lear character's perspective, but it is primarily from the children's point of view. You get the points of view of all three sisters, you get the Edmund character, and you get the Edgar character as well.
Interesting. So, of all the books that you mentioned, what book in your entire collection could you not live without, and why?
Oh, I can't answer that question. I would have to cheat. I would have to cheat so much and basically say, okay, I need a box, or I need my entire e-reader, or what. I couldn't answer that question.
All right. So, are there any, this last question before we go into a deep dive, are there any organizations or charity special events that our readers should be investigating or participating in at this time that you know of?
I mean, I've got a couple of links that I can send you to put into the show notes,
Hmm.
but I can't really think of anything specific off the top of my head in terms of special events or things like that. But kind of, I had sort of the list of charities like Doctors Without Borders and stuff like that. Um, and that seemed like kind of the way I was leaning.
Okay. Yeah, because I know. So you taught. So you were at MIT before this.
Yes.
Now you're now you're a full-time editor. And what
Mm-hmm.
else were you?
Indexer, which is a very odd job to have, and I never expected to fall into it. So when you're writing, especially a nonfiction book or an academic book, you need an index. You want people to be able to find stuff. And when I remember when I was working on my first book back in 2011, 2012, having to hire an indexer because I was teaching at two different universities at the time, and I could not put together an index for this book. I just didn't have the time. And so I ended up having to hire a professional indexer. And at the time I thought, oh my God, I am paying this person so much money. Fast forward 10, 11 years when I myself am working on indexes, and I am looking back on it and thinking, she did not charge me enough. She did not charge me enough for that job. She was very kind to a first-time academic author on a very tight schedule.
Wow. So an
Uh,
index that's what you get, and the back of
yep,
nonfiction, highly high profile academic work indexes. Jeez.
very important. Like it is, like
Ah,
it did not occur to me how important it was. And the thing is, I use indexes all the time. Every time I'm looking through an academic book, I inevitably end up looking for something in the index. And I have hit the point now where I can tell the difference between a well-done index and a poorly done index. But I have been doing that pretty much since everyone went into lockdown in 2020, because I lost my teaching job, and then people started asking me to do editing. And out of the blue, one of the scholars who I was doing editing work for asked if I could also index the book she was working on. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll give it a try. And I ended up actually quite liking it.
wow. But you would never thought you would find yourself in this position.
No, no, it's a very odd and extremely specialized job, but someone's got to do it. So
Yeah. Is it
I,
at least enjoyable?
yes, actually it is. It is a very different way to read a book, because you are looking at it from the perspective of, if I was a reader, if I was a first-time reader of this book, what am I looking for? What
Mhm.
terms would I want to be searching for? What are what are the big ideas that I'm trying to kind of trace through this book? And it is a very interesting way to read a book. It's not the way I usually do.
That's interesting how like when it comes to like an academic book, there are people that are specifically tasked for certain parts. You actually have a person that is in charge of the table of contents. Then you have a person who's in charge of what you say yourself as an indexer, the editor. Am I missing anything else? Like
Well,
the
yeah,
overall, what is that?
the author is responsible for the table of contents, and sometimes authors do their own indexes if they have time.
Mhm.
I have realized that I cannot index my own work. Like, I am really bad at it. So I would definitely hand that off to somebody else. But um, because one of the things that is useful about having somebody else index your project is, when you're writing it, you know how it is. You are in, like, you know exactly, you know the full context of every single word in that book. Um, and if you are indexing, you can't have that. You can't make those assumptions. You have to be looking at it almost as a first-time reader, because you have to be looking at it as you have to be looking at it from the perspective of, if I were looking for something in this book, what would I be looking for, and how would I try to find it? And that's how you get things like cross references. That's how you get things like this term appears once, but it's also linked to this other term that appears 18 times. And it becomes an interesting exercise in kind of looking at the large, and on the other side, you end up with the terms that are almost too large that show up on every single page of the book.
Yeah.
And that can be a different kind of challenge, because then you have to say, well, even though this is obviously a very important part of this book, I can't physically index it because there are instances on every single page. And that would just be unwieldy, and a press would throw it out. So it's an interesting challenge.
That's interesting though, because I remember, when I was taking the SAT, one of the questions I remember was if you had to look up this particular section, where in the I think we were provided like an index, and it gave us a particular subject. Where in the index listed down would you find it? And I don't think a lot of students understand or bother to use the index, like specifically, when it comes to elementary, understandable. Middle school, okay. High school, some students still do not bother to use the index. They will look at the table of contents, because if they're looking for a specific chapter on something that they're supposed to do, then yes. But if they are looking for something else, sometimes this is what a lot of students miss, is look at the index. And you are absolutely right. I have a not to go off tangent here, but I have a book on natural healing remedies, and there's an incredible big index in there. But one of the things that I was curious about was, and this is something that is in my family, is about acid reflux and heartburn, and what are the remedies for that. And there's certain other terms that come with it, and those terms are not anywhere in that index, which is interesting. So
yeah, and like I said, it really varies from book to book.
Yeah.
And it's been very interesting kind of working on it from that angle, because sometimes when you're working on an index, it does actually help to have some amount of subject matter expertise. And so a lot of the books that I work with tend to be medieval, early modern. I've got one random one that I'm working on now that's on romanticism. So trying to keep things interesting.
Right. But speaking of medievalism, and I think you mentioned it earlier, but I wasn't quite sure you delve into it. What actually sparked your interest in medievalism in the beginning, and then how did you decide to make that your profession as a scholar, fandom studies scholar? How did all that play out?
Oh my gosh, there were a lot of steps to that. It actually, I mean, again, it began sort of when I was a kid, and partly I blame Disney, because I was a Disney kid. I grew up with all like the animated movies. And my favorite, at least until Beauty and the Beast came out, my favorite was Sleeping Beauty, which is a strange choice. And not most people look at me and go, wait, what, that one? I've never even seen that one. I'm like, well, it is actually much better than you think it is. But the big thing was, it was so pretty. I loved the art style. And there's no other Disney movie that looks like it. Like Robin Hood kind of comes close, but it's still
a little bit. Yes.
Yeah, it's got kind of a similar vibe, but it doesn't go like full tilt into it like Sleeping Beauty does. Sleeping Beauty is like an illuminated manuscript came to life.
Thank you.
And yeah, I wrote an essay on it that I posted on the Public Medievalist a couple of years ago, about watching it with my daughter and having to kind of contextualize things for her. Like when people throw in lines like, oh, she's 16, she's an adult. I'm like, no, when you're 16, you're not an adult. Stop. Don't listen to that. So things like that. But yeah, overall, like it was a very interesting experience to rewatch it as an adult, especially as an adult with my then 5-year-old sitting next to me watching it with me. So that was part of it. The kind of encountering the Arthurian legend about when I was kind of 5, 6 years old. It was through actually Lerner and Loewe's Camelot, the musical.
Ah,
And that kind of, it got me obsessed with knights, and knights in shining armor and all of that fun stuff. And it kind of never left. It was always sort of bubbling along in the background, even while I was trying to kind of spread my interest out to other things. I went on a significant tangent in undergrad and my master's working on the 19th century, but then ended up kind of wandering back to the medieval for my PhD. But even when I was working on the 19th century, I was working on 19th century reimaginings of medieval and early modern stuff. So I was looking at kind of how the Romantics interacted with Shakespeare and things like that. So I was always kind of it was always there. It was, even if it was not necessarily front and center, it was always there. And then basically, so I had the Arthurian legend, and then when I was 13, I first encountered a book about the Wars of the Roses, and that was kind of the other cornerstone of how I ended up doing medieval studies.
yeah. So, all right. So, yeah, The Sleeping Beauty, and I didn't know if you bothered. I am so glad that I actually went to go see it this year. Have you ever been to California?
Long time ago. I went when I was a kid, and we did go to Disneyland when I was there. So I have like very vague memories of it, but nothing very clear. Like I know we were there because there are photos of me there, but that's about all. It's about it.
They had, and they had this all the time at the Getty, because I actually went to that site, globalmedievalism.org.
Yes.
So, and I just happened to, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be looking at, but there's that interactive map where you can click on one of those locations. So the one I chose was California, and it's all about the Getty. I go there all the time for their medieval manuscript exhibitions, but considering it's in a very small wing, the most interesting thing that I saw not recently, but before that, they had a chivalry knights demonstration just outside.
Yes, I remember. I've heard about those. Yeah,
and that was amazing. But if you ever come to California, they only had it this one time, I think. But speaking of Sleeping Beauty, I went to the Ronald Reagan Museum a few years ago, where they were doing Disney's second golden age, and before that, so they had the books on display in the museum. But at the Huntington, my friend's sister works in human resources at the Disney Museum in San Francisco, so she helped put together this exhibition at the Huntington Library and Museum, and they actually had those. I think there were 4 pages of Sleeping Beauty in there. I could not believe how big they were. It was
huge.
insane.
I believe it.
But it was absolutely stupendous. But it was all about, and I thought I had the book with me, but it's Disney's obsession, or Disney's under something, Walt Disney and French decor influence, something like that.
Yes, I actually. What was it? I think I actually read an article about that, and it was fascinating. But yes, it was like French Rococo or something like that. I remember specifically reading about that.
Yeah,
and I think I found it while I was working on that Sleeping Beauty piece. But yes, I do remember reading that, and I remember like nodding along with it as I was reading. I was like, oh yeah, I definitely see all of this. But no, that's very much sort of part and parcel of modern medievalism. You can't talk about modern medievalism in the West without talking about Disney, because it's just so much a part of their whole image. So yeah, I mean, so in terms of kind of medievalism, I've always been interested in it. And it took me a very long time to find the right angle to look at it. And it was really only after I finished my PhD that I was really able to study it. Because while you're doing your PhD, you are expected to be very, very laser focused on that and only that. And afterward, I was able to kind of pursue some of my other more esoteric research interests. That's where all the fan studies stuff came in. Because while I was doing all of this academic stuff, I was also kind of hanging out in fan spaces and seeing the way that things worked there and finding so many commonalities between what fans were doing in fan spaces and what the writers I was writing about were doing. And so I've been doing a lot of work on connections between modern fan communities and pre-modern literary communities.
That was another question I was going to ask you, because I had never heard of this type of study in college studies before. Would you know around what year did fandom studies become an actual academic? Like when did that become part of academia?
I mean, depending on who you ask, it still isn't, but
yeah.
It is. So the first kind of studies about fandom were coming out in the 1970s. So it's actually been around for a while, but it's only been in the past, I would say, 10 to 15 years that it has become more established as an academic discipline. There are enough people working on it from enough different perspectives. You have literature people working on it, like me. You have people in communications working on it. You have people in art history working on it, people in film, people in digital humanities, kind of looking at how kind of digital spaces are curated. There's all kinds of great work out there, and if for anyone who is curious about fan studies, I would recommend the open source academic journal Transformative Works and Cultures. Partly because it is open source, it is very easy. You can just go to their website and read any article that you want. And they have a lot of really good stuff, and they also have a lot of the newest kind of research that's coming out.
I'm sorry, it's called the open source book?
No, it's an open source journal, which means it's open access. So anyone can read it. You don't have to paywall. It's not paywalled. But the journal itself is called Transformative Works and Cultures.
Transformative Works and Cultures. Got it. Okay, yeah, because I've looked into like the other ones I've looked into were JSTOR.
Yep.
And Eric, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot think of the other one for the life of me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was using those in college too. But yeah. I think unless if you have like a membership through an institution, you have to pay for it. So I'm like, can I just get something that is free, please?
But yes, this one is completely free. It is completely open access, and the articles are really great.
Got it. So speaking of articles and speaking of publications, we got yours.
Yes.
So on this one, this was interesting how you and Helen Young, that you looked at medievalism. You call it the reimagining and repurposing of the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages we call it the Middle Ages because it was after the fact, and that here you said. Where is it? Created by 15th century Italian humanists to delineate the millennium or so, because some people may look to the 1990s as the Middle Ages of that time, but we wouldn't consider that the Middle Ages. We call it the 20th century. There's something about the word Middle Ages versus medievalism versus ours. But it's interesting. You said there were, I think there's 2 or 3 that you call here. So let's see, medievalism is always about the present and points towards the future, even as it reimagines the past. So you're talking about A Song of Ice, you're talking about the Vikings, you're talking about the Lord of the Rings, and how they're very much the white centric Western civilization lens. And because we've been brought up to see it from our perspective, from that lens, that is the world where we can kind of see, oh yes, this is how we agree with those lines. But then you're talking about
Yes.
another one that I wanted to read this book for the reading challenge this year, but I didn't get to. The Priory of the Orange Tree.
Yes, that one is very interesting. Like it's one of those books where, again, like I don't agree with everything. I think that in some ways it was one of those books that should have been 2 or 3 books. It should have been larger just to kind of resolve all of the plot, because it was a gigantic plot. But it was a very interesting kind of counterpoint to a lot of the sort of, I guess, stereotypical medievalisms that were out there. Even if in some cases, like, she didn't quite delve into as much detail as I might have liked. And she didn't and there were elements that she could have done more with that she didn't. Overall, it's still a very interesting book that does a lot of interesting stuff, especially if you are someone who reads a lot of fantasy. You'll sort of see all of these elements scattered throughout it, but you will see how she's doing different things with them. It's like there are dragons, but they do different things. There are there's like a secret MacGuffin sword, but it does a different thing and it works in a different way, and it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there were 3 things that I took away from reading this. One is that you mentioned mobilities, and the other was, I'm not sure if there were 2 or 3, but you mentioned temporal medievalism and spatial medievalism. Yes. Can you quickly go over all 3?
Yes.
And what you mean by that?
So temporal medievalism is the idea that the medieval is a separate time that can be kind of compartmentalized and put away. And that we are automatically ahead of it. We are progressing. It's part of the kind of big narrative of progress that happens starting with the Enlightenment. Spatial medievalism is about geography. It's about looking at the world, again, from a kind of very white, Eurocentric, Anglo-American centric perspective, and looking at other parts of the world and going, oh, that's medieval. And you see this in mainstream media discourse all the time. Like people talk about, oh yeah, the countries in the Middle East have such a medieval mentality. And it's meant to be a derogatory, derogatory judgment. Yeah. But there's nothing medieval about that. It's modern. It's right here. So a lot of what people who study medievalism are doing are trying to collapse those artificial borders and say, look, if you're seeing something that looks medieval, maybe instead of throwing it into a box and saying, oh, that's medieval, we don't need to think about it anymore. Maybe you need to consider why it's still here. Like, why are we still grappling with the same things 1,500 years later? Maybe we should think about that. And trying to, because one of the things that I have often been very frustrated with as an academic is these artificial divides, because it's not just artificial divides between time periods, like you look at people, sometimes students come to me and they would say, it's like, okay, well, where does the medieval period end? And I'm like, well, that's a good question, because depending on who you ask, it never did. Because there is no line, there is no year when you could say, this is the end of the medieval and this is the beginning of the modern. It's like that doesn't exist. Right. And so a lot of the things that we would consider to be modern inventions are not. They have been around for a very long time. There are lots of people who will want to tell you that racism is a modern thing. It isn't. It has been here as long as there have been people. It has just gone under a different name. It has just manifested itself differently. And that is what a lot of scholars in medieval studies are working on now and are getting a lot of pushback about, is trying to explain, like, no, pre-modern race theory is a thing. You just have to pay attention to it. We have just been collectively ignoring it for a while. And part of that is because, like it or not, the roots of medieval academia, or the academic study of the medieval period, coincide with the rise of colonialism. And it was part of a movement, and we discussed this in the introduction to the book. It was part of this movement to create a white European culture that could stand in opposition to all of the places they were colonizing.
Yeah. And then what about the thing on mobilities? We're going to mention that.
The thing about mobilities, what we were interested in was kind of using the concept of mobilities to consider interactions between different people in different spaces, how the medieval can kind of transcend geographical limitations, transcend geographical boundaries. Because when you think about kind of medieval mobilities, the prevailing assumption for a very long time has been that people in the medieval period didn't go anywhere. Like, you were born in a village, you stayed in the village, you didn't go anywhere. But the fact is, there was a lot of movement. There was a ton of movement. Like, you wonder, how did spices get from Indonesia to England? There had to be a way that they got there.
Yeah.
And there were multiple ways that they got there. There were ways that were by land, there were ways that were by sea, there were ways that were a combination of the two. So trying to kind of apply that lens to medievalism was one of the things we were attempting to do, to kind of talk about how medievalism isn't just a European thing. There are other ways to interact with it. And our book was intended as just an opening to a conversation. And we're hoping that other books later on in the series will be able to talk more in detail about specific kinds of medievalisms in other parts of the world.
So there are more, in other words, you're saying that there are more publications to come, or that there are like already in process?
Yes. So the book came out as part of what is called the Cambridge Elements series on the global Middle Ages. And it's all these kind of tiny little books that are available both electronically and in hard copy. And they basically focus very, very narrowly on specific aspects of the global medieval world. And it's trying to kind of push this idea that the medieval isn't just about Europe. And even though, like, the term medieval is not one that you find outside of Europe, like, you don't find people in China talking about the medieval. You don't find people in Southern Africa talking about the medieval. They use different terms. There's a different reckoning of time. And those things are all things that academics have to grapple with at this point. But irrespective of that, there's this sense in pretty much every culture of looking back to a prior time, either as a contrast to the present day or as something to aspire to. And if you consider a kind of broader definition of medievalism as this sort of almost nostalgia, but not quite, you could potentially apply it to anyone.
Because one of the medieval scholars that I've been watching is Mike Lowe's. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
I have.
Yeah, so I don't want to go too on a tangent here, but he did this special called Going Medieval, and what he said at the end was that the people of the Middle Ages were not medieval; they considered themselves modern.
Yes,
so that's
they did.
What plays in that's what plays in today. So because you are, and I think you even mentioned, because you're a woman of mixed race or color, when you were doing your studies, did you face any obstacles as a woman in trying to get your master's and your doctorate? Did you face any obstacles because of those things from the scholars that you were educated by?
Yes and no. It was a lot of it was stuff that I did not realize at the time. A lot of it is kind of things that I only realized in retrospect. And part of that is academic culture. The fact is that, no bones about it, academic culture is incredibly racist. It just is.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, it just is. That is just an unfortunate fact. And one of the things that I have noticed, particularly amongst scholars of color, especially now that we are all talking to each other, which is not something we were doing when I was a graduate student. I was very much kind of the one, but there were three of us. There were three of us in my entire graduate cohort. And I'm talking like several years of graduate students. There were only three in my entire department. So that is a very small minority of people. And we did not really have a specific source of support in that regard. Now looking back on it, having found a scholarly community, I can see things and I can identify things that I couldn't at the time. And a lot of it was less about overt racism, and most of it was about kind of just a lack of opportunity and not being considered serious enough. Which is a problem that is very much an intersectional problem that faces that faces people of color, that faces women, and it faces especially women of color. And it is this perception that your research is somehow less that there's this. Okay, let me start again. There's this perception that academic research is supposed to be impartial. But the problem is that the people deciding what's impartial are a bunch of old white men. So it is what old white men regard as impartial, not what is actually impartial, which is nothing. There is no impartiality. You can't be impartial. It's not like math where there's a right answer and a wrong answer. If you're looking at literary analysis, at historical analysis, there is no single right answer. And depending on your point of view, you can get completely opposing versions of the same event. So that was something that in recent years, I have been doing more in my work. I have been sort of putting myself into my work much more because now I feel that I have the freedom to do that.
Awesome.
And that was not something I had when I was a graduate student. I was very, very keen on kind of flying under the radar, being as quote unquote impartial as possible. And I think that my scholarship has improved by acknowledging my own positionality. And I think that more academics doing that would be better for academia as a whole.
Awesome. That's great. Well, Dr. Kavita, I want to thank you so much for today's interview. And I'm looking forward to the next medieval scholarly articles, because I can definitely use your help with this project. I'll definitely be writing to you about that. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been great.
All right. Awesome. I'll see you later.
See you later.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.